This program is brought to you by the Reeves Law Firm, www.reevesfirm.com.
In the know.
Good evening, everyone.
In the know. Tony Reeves. Tony Reeves. Tony Reeves. Tony Reeves. Fire. Following the news in any way, shape, or form. No shortage of things to talk about. What does it mean? What will it bring? Is this a reality we simply have to accept? Tony Reeves. Fire. Tony Reeves.
Let's go ahead and get started.
A lot of you get forms from the Social Security Administration and probably have a lot of questions about what you should actually put in these forms. Today, we're going to take some time to go over one particular form that comes up fairly regularly and give you some tips that might be helpful to you so that this way when you're completing the form, you'll have a little bit better guidance in terms of what you should put. I hope it helps.
Today we're going to talk about some of the information that you receive on these forms. And if I say anything that insults your intelligence, please trust when I tell you there's a rationale and reason behind why I'm saying certain things. So I hope the information I provide is helpful to you. You're going to find that you're going to get during the course of your application process what's called an adult function report. Remember, this report is designed to give Social Security some information about how your condition impacts your ability to do certain things. Let me be blunt, and I've said this before, and I'm not trying to be offensive when I say it. Social Security is not in your life every day. They really don't know how you handle things on a day-to-day basis. So they're trying to get an understanding of how your condition impacts you. You don't want them to have to figure it out. You want to make sure you spell it out to them as much as you possibly can. Now, here's a couple of things I want you to be aware of. When you're providing information about your daytime telephone number, that's the number they want to be able to get in contact with you. You want to make sure you give them that information so that this way they can get to you as quickly as possible if they have any discrepancies. Now, this is going to sound really silly, but I want to focus on something here. When we start talking about how does your condition or illness affect your ability to work, the reality is when you're answering this question, you want to be very clear. How does your condition impact your ability to work? Not impact your ability to do things at the house or go out in the streets. That's going to be later parts in the application form, in this form that'll give you a chance to explain those things. But you want to be clear about how your condition affects your ability to work. You want to spell it out to them as much as possible. Your daily activities really focuses on what you do on a day-to-day basis. And some of these questions I know sound really silly, but kind of look at it from their standpoint. They're using this form as an opportunity for them to walk through your normal day. So when they're asking you, what's going on from the time you wake up to the time until you go to bed, that's your opportunity to kind of walk them through what goes on in your day-to-day life. Okay? So I know it's going to be kind of goofy, but you want to make sure you pay attention and just think about, okay, around what time do I get up in the morning, around what time I go to bed at night. Most people don't have a clean schedule in terms of how they do it. So, if they're having odd sleeping patterns and you're waking up at different times, you're going to bed at different times, if in any event you want to explain that to Social Security so that they know. You also want to make sure that you explain if you take care of other people. This usually comes up when I have parents who have to take care of kids, or you're taking care of pets or things like that, or if anybody helps you take care of those things. Now, here's where you've got to keep it in mind, and this is where people kind of get tripped up, because people like to represent sometimes when they fill out these forms that they can't do anything. So when you're saying you can't do anything, you now find yourself in this unique position. How are you saying you can't do anything, but you have people that you have to take care of? See where I'm going with this? So you got to make sure that you kind of explain the circumstances. Most people forget the fact that they have loved ones who help them, or the people they take care of, they don't technically take care of them as much as they used to. Like if you have kids and you say, well, I take care of my kid. Well, my child is like 13, so there's a lot of stuff they can do independently they don't need me to do. And so, and also stop and think about those things that you used to do that you can no longer do. And I'm going to tell you, when you fill out these forms, you're going to want to take the time to kind of stop and think, okay, what in the heck are they talking about? Because the reality is that if you don't tell them specifically what type of things that you used to do that you can't do, like for instance, let's say that you were very active, you used to go play tennis, basketball, horseback riding, but now you don't do any of those things. Well, let them know. Same thing when they're asking about, does your injury and illness affect your ability to sleep? Does it wake you up in the middle of the night? How many times are you getting up during the course of the night? Are you going, when you get up, are you going right back to bed afterwards? Explain all that. Same thing about personal care. This may seem so obvious to people, but we don't think about those little things. What I tend to find that people have a habit of doing is giving 1 to 3 word answers for each one of these. Explain how your illness, injury, or condition affects your ability to dress. I don't dress myself. Well, that doesn't tell Social Security anymore anything. Well, I don't bathe myself. Well, that doesn't tell them anything. Be specific. Usually what I end up finding out is, like, for instance, if you got a bad back or something like that, I'll ask them, I'm like, well, what's going on with your back? Well, what happens is that my husband or my wife will tie my shoes for me, or I don't wear, regular shoes. I wear slip-ons. Those are things that Social Security needs to know. Don't leave them in the dark and have them trying to figure out what it is. This is your chance to explain to them how your condition impacts you. And you want to talk about all the other things that may impact you as well. It may not seem like much, but it's very important in the grander scheme of things. Things that you do that we take for granted, like personal care. Do you need somebody to remind you to take your medications? Those things are important, because if you're saying that you have a difficulty with your memory, you want to make sure you let them know that, yeah, I need somebody to help. And when you say, what kind of help do you need? Somebody takes my prescriptions down. They write down when I'm supposed to take them. They can remind me constantly. Those are little nuances that you want to explain in detail. Same thing, preparing your own meals. A lot of times people gloss over preparing your meals, but let's stop and think about it. If you're used to making, breaking out the crock pot and the deep fry skillet, and you're able to go to town, but you can't do those things anymore, why? Is it because of the bending over and reaching, trying to get the different types of utensils and appliances? Or is it because you have a memory issue and you don't want to leave anything on the stove to set the house on fire? Spell those nuances. Same thing. How often? The reality is that Social Security assumes you got to eat. So you got to make sure you explain to them, how are you eating? Are you eating daily? Are you eating TV dinners? Lay it out for them. So this way that they know what's going on. Same thing, house and yard work. Now, this might be a little bit more tricky if you find yourself in a situation where you're living in an apartment, but think about it. Little things, house and yard work. Are you dusting? Are you mopping? Are you cleaning? Are you doing laundry? Are you cutting the grass? Are you gardening? All of those things you want to lay out to Social Security, so this way they know the circumstances of how you do things. This way there's no confusion about what exactly you can do. You know what the most frustrating thing people get when they say these things is? They're like, I can't put all that information on these little spaces. Well, that's why they have a remarks page. That's why you provide an attachment. But here's the problem that most people run across, is they do two things. Either they're too short or they're too long-winded. And so you're like, well, how do I find that balance? Look at your answers and ask yourself the question, are you getting to the point as clearly as possible? Now, I know what's going to happen. Some of you are going to say, well, that's part of my disability. Well, that's why you have friends and family help you. So, because you got to remember, this is written on an 8th grade level. So the idea is that someone should be able to read it and be able to understand succinctly what you're doing. What you're saying. But remember, again, like I said, this is not trying to insult you. This is designed for you to educate Social Security about your situation. So they're going to want to know things like, how often do you go outside? And you say, well, that's important. And you're like, why is that relevant? Well, if you're saying that you have a fear of dealing with the general public, that's going to be relevant. How often do you go outside? Because presumably if you go outside, there's people outside. Or maybe not just necessarily just because of who you get along with. Let's say you also say you have breathing problems, and that going out into the elements causes you to have breathing issues. Well, how often do you go outside? So they want to know. Same thing. When you're going to different places to travel, they want to know. Walking, driving, riding in the car, riding a bike. When you go out, can you go out alone? All these things are things that, and this is where people kind of lose sight. They all tie into what you're saying you can and you can't do. So let's go to the point about, let's try this as an example. Let's say you say, I have a very bad back. Very bad back, so I can't sit more than 2 or 3 minutes at a time, because if that happens, I have to go lay down. Well, guess what? Do you do you go out? Sure. You drive a car? Yeah. Can you go out alone? Sure. Do you drive? Sure. Okay. The presumption is there are very few places that you're going to be in a car for like 2 minutes, unless you're literally right next door to someplace. So what happens is that people, they basically kind of create conflicts within here. So what do you mean by that? Well, what I'm basically saying is you've got to think about these things a little bit further. So if you say you can't sit for longer than 5 minutes, do you go to the grocery store? Sure. How do you get there? I drive. Well, when you drive to the grocery store, is there any problems? In terms of, getting there and doing what you need to do? It's important because maybe your driving is, well, the grocery store is right around the corner, so I don't mind driving there. Or if I go to my doctor's appointment, I have to leave, even though my doctor is 15 minutes away, I have to leave 2 hours early because I have to keep stopping repeatedly along the way because I have nobody to drive me. See, you want to fill in you don't want the government to fill in the blanks for you. You want to lay it out and spell it out to them so that this way they can understand specifically the nature of your situation. Same thing with shopping. If you do any shopping, they want to know the circumstances behind it. And it said, describe what you shop for. Are you going for little things? Are you going for longer things? How often do you go? Do you go once a month? Or do you go for, every other week? All of these things lay in play. So for instance, let's say, you say you don't get along with the general public, but you go shopping every week. See how that looks kind of weird? I'm not saying that you can't do that. And I don't want anybody to think that I'm telling you can't go grocery shopping. I'm just saying you've got to keep it in its context in terms of how they're comparing the two information. Same thing with money. If you're paying for your own bills and taking care of your own finances, they're going to want to know about those things. Spell it out for them. After a while, all these things start to look redundant, and you're probably saying to yourself, I am so confused. Why do we find ourselves keep running over these things over and over again? It's quite simply because of this. Once they start looking at this information, they're trying to compare the two. So you need to start asking yourself the questions, hey, what are your interests and hobbies and interests? How often do you do them? Describe any changes. Like, what did I talk about before? Like, for instance, this is not trying to be funny. Let's say you used to play basketball as a hobby. You don't do those things anymore. Let's say your hobby is you like to play basketball. How often, and how well do you do these things? Not at all. Describe any changes in these activities. Well, since I hurt my back, I can't go on the basketball court. Bam, you've connected the dots. Same thing. Social activities. They're going to want to know about these things. Do you spend time with other people? And more importantly, what kind of things you do. And here you want to lay it out. Who do you spend time with? Is it you going to spend time with them, or do they come spend time with you? Do you need to be reminded to go places? Do you go to the ball? Do you go to the movie theater? Do you go to the restaurant? Remember, you don't want the government to fill in the gaps for you. You're laying it out for them so that they can understand. So now as we're going through this information, they're going to start asking you more specifics again about information about your abilities. Now, this is going to sound goofy, but follow along with me. When they start getting you to this portion right here, the sections about your abilities, pay close attention to what you've talked about already. So what does that mean? Well, remember now, by this point, you're at page 6 of 8. So you've already answered about 5 pages worth of information. So you want to make sure you spell out how all these things affect your ability. And when I mean all these things, I'm talking about all these things here through here. You want to explain now how all those things affects your ability to do things. And so when you're thinking about it, think about the answers that you've already provided. Think about the fact that if you say, I can do my own bills, I can take care of my own appointments, I go to places on my own, but then you say you have memory issues, or you have problems with concentration. They're going to say, okay, how do we weigh those two? You're saying you have problems, but we can't tell from your prior answers how you actually have problems. So it says, how far can you walk before you need to stop to take a break? Stop and rest. For how long can you pay attention? You want to, when you're answering these questions, this is going to sound silly, not saying that you're like a homework assignment, but pay close attention to the nature of how you've explained things previously in your earlier answers. So this way, the two kind of match up with each other. Now you want to be as descriptive as possible when they start asking you some of these very particular things that may seem kind of weird. Like, how well do you get along with authority figures? Have you ever been fired or laid off and so forth? How well do you handle stress? So it's so easy to say, how well do you handle stress? I don't. Well, that doesn't tell anybody anything. Be specific. How well do you handle changes in routine? I don't. Well, what does that mean? You want to make sure you spell out, well, for instance, how well you and most people say, I don't know how to explain it. Yes, you do. What happens when you get stressed? Well, A, B, C, D, E, F, G. Well, guess what? That's how you handle stress. Like I had a client once. I asked her, I said, how do you handle stress? Not well. That didn't tell me anything. Well, what do you want me to say? When I get stressed out, I get upset, I get mad, I get agitated, and then I end up, going into my room, shutting the door for hours on end. You've just told me how you handle stress. Oh, it's really not overly complicated. It's just this. You've got to remember, you are an expert on you. Educate everybody about how you are. And same thing, when you start getting down to devices and so forth, if you use crutches, walkers, wheelchairs, canes, things of that nature, Social Security is going to want to know, are you getting that on your own or is somebody prescribing? Because they're going to start looking through the medical records to see if somebody actually prescribed you these things. All these things are useful tools for them. And finally, here's the section you need to fill in the blanks for anything that's missing. You want to use this as an opportunity right here to provide anything extra that you may have overlooked. Okay, make sure you take the opportunity to let them know the medications you're taking, if you're taking anything or any side effects, and more importantly, who filled out this form for you. Okay, who filled out this form for you? You want them to know if it was you or someone else. So this way, they'll know if somebody had to help you with this form or not. I know I went through this form a little quickly. I could have easily made this video an hour long. I just didn't want to bore you guys to death going over each one. If you'd like me to do a longer video on filling out a form, or if there's particular forms that you'd like some guidance on, let me know and I'll be more than happy to do a longer video on that. I hope this helps you out, everybody. I know these forms are a pain in the backside, but remember, Social Security is trying to get educated about you. You are an expert on you, so make sure you take the time to educate them.